Hello everyone. If you enjoy my channel, please support me with one like, one subscribe, and one share.
The unexpected request. What if the person you trusted most looked into your eyes one ordinary evening and quietly said, "I need some space." And suddenly every dream you had built together felt like it was collapsing? Have you ever replayed one sentence over and over until it sounded different every single time? If you've ever worried that love can disappear without warning, stay with me. My story surprised me, and I have a feeling it might surprise you too. Along the way, you'll also hear simple English that you can easily listen to, read, and repeat while discovering what really happened inside my marriage. I never expected one short sentence to change the way I looked at love, marriage, and even the English language. My name doesn't really matter. What matters is that I am just an ordinary wife living in the United States, raising my children, balancing grocery lists, laundry baskets, school events, and quiet evenings that usually felt safe. Nothing looked unusual from the outside. Our neighbors smiled at us. Our kids laughed around the dinner table. We still drank coffee together on Saturday mornings. If someone had asked me whether my marriage was happy, I would have answered yes without hesitation. Then one Tuesday evening, everything shifted. My husband stood in the kitchen holding a mug of coffee that had already gone cold. He didn't look angry. He didn't raise his voice. He simply took a slow breath and said, "I think I need some space." Space. One simple English word. I had heard it many times before while practicing English listening. I knew the dictionary meaning. I thought I understood it. But in that moment, it felt completely different. Did space mean silence? Did it mean distance? Did it mean another woman? Did it mean our marriage was already ending while I was still smiling in family photos? My heart raced so fast that I barely heard the next few sentences. It was strange how fear can make even familiar English sound like a foreign language. My brain kept translating every word into the worst possible meaning. That night I couldn't sleep. Outside our window, the quiet American neighborhood looked peaceful. Streetlights reflected softly on parked cars. Somewhere in the distance, I heard a dog bark once before everything became silent again. The peaceful view only made the storm inside me feel louder. The next morning I decided to do something unusual. Instead of searching dramatic relationship advice online, I opened one of my favorite slow English recordings. The speaker calmly repeated simple sentences. Take a deep breath. Listen carefully. Meaning depends on context. I smiled for only a second. Meaning depends on context. Maybe that sentence wasn't just helping my English. Maybe it was trying to teach me something about my marriage. Psychologists often explain that when people experience uncertainty, the brain naturally fills missing information with negative stories because uncertainty activates our survival instincts. In other words, when we don't know the truth, our imagination often becomes our worst enemy. That realization didn't erase my fear, but it made me stop believing every frightening thought that entered my mind. Still, I couldn't ignore what my husband had said. Over the next few days, I noticed little things I had never paid attention to before. He spent more time walking alone after dinner. He smiled less often. Sometimes he stared out the living room window without saying anything. Yet he still helped our children with homework. He still asked whether I wanted tea. Nothing completely fit the story I had created in my head. And then, 3 nights later, I accidentally found something on our kitchen table that made my hands freeze in place. It wasn't a message from another woman. It wasn't divorce papers. In some ways, it was even more frightening. Silent days at home. What would scare you more, a painful truth, or a mystery that refuses to explain itself? Sometimes the loudest warning sign in a marriage is not an argument. It is silence. Have you ever shared the same house with someone you love and suddenly felt like you were standing on opposite sides of an invisible wall? That was exactly where I found myself. I thought I was searching for answers. But I was about to discover that my biggest misunderstanding had nothing to do with love, and everything to do with what I assumed. I stared at the paper on the kitchen table for what felt like forever. My husband had left before sunrise, and the house was unusually quiet. The paper wasn't a legal document or a secret letter. It was a printed brochure for a counseling center in our city. Across the top, in calm blue letters, it read, "Managing stress, burnout, and emotional fatigue." My first reaction was relief. My second reaction was confusion. Why hadn't he told me? Why had he asked for space instead of asking for help? My mind immediately started creating another story, one that sounded just believable enough to hurt. Maybe he didn't trust me anymore. Maybe I had become part of the pressure instead of part of the comfort. I made coffee but forgot to drink it. I folded the same towel twice because I couldn't remember if I had already finished. Even the cheerful sounds from children riding bicycles outside our window couldn't quiet the questions inside my head. That afternoon, while preparing dinner, I played another slow English story in the background. The narrator repeated one sentence several times, "Don't assume. Ask." The words were simple enough for any English learner, but they landed in my heart with surprising force. I repeated them aloud while chopping vegetables. Don't assume. Ask. It sounded almost too easy. Yet I realized I had done the exact opposite for days. I had assumed everything and asked nothing. Research in relationship psychology often shows that couples under stress frequently misinterpret neutral behavior as rejection because anxious minds naturally search for danger even when there is none. That explained why every quiet moment suddenly looked suspicious to me. Every sigh sounded like disappointment. Every delayed reply felt like emotional distance. The truth was, I had been translating my husband's silence the same way a beginner sometimes mistranslates an English sentence, focusing on one unfamiliar word while completely missing the meaning of the whole conversation. That evening he came home carrying groceries, smiling gently at our children as if nothing had changed. He asked whether I wanted fresh strawberries because they were on sale at the local market. His voice sounded warm, not cold. That confused me even more. If he wanted to leave, why was he still remembering my favorite fruit? During dinner our kids laughed about a funny moment at school, and for a few minutes our home almost felt normal again. Then I noticed my husband quietly rubbing his temples as though he had a headache he didn't want anyone to see. It lasted only a second, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. After everyone went upstairs, I found him standing alone on the back porch, watching the summer sky slowly darken over our peaceful American neighborhood. I almost walked outside. I almost asked the question that had been keeping me awake for nights. Instead, fear whispered, "What if the answer breaks your heart?" So I stayed behind the glass door, watching the man I loved from only a few feet away, yet feeling farther from him than ever before. Just as I turned to go back inside, my phone vibrated. A message appeared from an unknown number. It contained only one sentence. "You deserve to know what's really happening." My heart stopped. I looked toward my husband on the porch. Then back at the glowing screen, knowing that whichever one I chose first might change everything. Looking back together. Have you ever received one message that made your heart race so fast you almost believed it before checking if it was true? That night, I realized something frightening. The most dangerous voice in a marriage isn't always another person. It can be the story your own mind keeps repeating. I thought I was about to uncover a painful secret. Instead, I opened a door to memories I had ignored for far too long, and one forgotten conversation suddenly changed everything. I stood in my kitchen staring at the message on my phone. You deserve to know what's really happening. There was no name. No explanation. Just those 8 words. My fingers hovered over the screen, ready to reply, but something stopped me. Instead of answering immediately, I locked the phone and placed it face down on the counter. For the first time in days, I asked myself a simple question. Why was I so ready to believe a stranger before talking to my own husband? That question was uncomfortable because I already knew the answer. Fear always speaks louder than trust when we stop listening carefully. I quietly stepped outside onto the back porch where my husband was still watching the evening sky. The warm summer air carried the smell of fresh-cut grass, and children were still laughing somewhere down the street. Everything around us looked peaceful, yet neither of us knew how to begin the conversation. Before I could speak, he smiled gently and said, "Beautiful sunset, isn't it?" His voice sounded tired but kind. It reminded me of the man I had fallen in love with, not the stranger I had imagined during so many sleepless nights. I smiled back, but the words stayed trapped inside me. Later that night, while everyone else was asleep, I opened an old photo album on my tablet. There were pictures from family picnics, birthday parties, weekend road trips, snowy mornings, and simple dinners that had never seemed important until now. I noticed something surprising. In almost every picture, we weren't doing anything extraordinary. We were simply laughing, holding hands, looking at each other without needing perfect words. Somewhere along the way, life had become so busy that we had started measuring love by conversations instead of quiet moments. As I continued scrolling, another memory returned. A few months earlier, my husband had come home exhausted after work and quietly said, "I'm just tired." I had answered, "We're all tired." At the time, I thought I was encouraging him to stay positive. Now I wondered if he had actually been asking for understanding. Sometimes the smallest conversations leave the deepest marks because they are forgotten too quickly. The next morning, while folding laundry, I played another slow English lesson. The narrator repeated, "Listen to understand, not to reply." I paused the recording and repeated the sentence several times. The words were easy to pronounce, making them perfect listening and speaking practice, but they also carried a lesson I desperately needed. Relationship researchers often explain that healthy couples are not the ones who never face stress. They are the ones who stay curious instead of becoming defensive. Curiosity asks, "What are you feeling?" Fear asks, "What are you hiding?" Without realizing it, I had spent an entire week asking fear's question. That afternoon, I finally opened the anonymous message again. There was another notification waiting. My pulse quickened as I tapped it. This time it included a photo. My husband was sitting inside a small cafe across town with another woman. They were leaning across the table, deep in conversation. My stomach tightened instantly. Every terrible possibility rushed back into my mind. But then I looked closer. The woman wasn't smiling. Neither was my husband. Both of them looked heartbroken. Before I could zoom in any further, another message arrived beneath the picture. This photo doesn't tell the whole story. Meet me tomorrow if you really want the truth. Learning before judging. Would you trust a mysterious stranger, or the person you've shared your life with? That question followed me all night. The photo on my phone looked convincing, almost impossible to explain away. But here's the frightening part. The human brain loves quick conclusions because they feel safer than uncertainty. I was only one decision away from changing my marriage forever. And I still had no idea whether I was chasing the truth, or becoming the victim of a perfectly timed misunderstanding. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the photo again. My husband sitting across from another woman in a quiet cafe somewhere in our city. They weren't smiling. They weren't touching. Yet my imagination kept adding details that didn't exist. It amazed me how easily fear could edit a story without asking permission. Early the next morning, I stood in the kitchen making pancakes for the kids while pretending everything felt normal. My husband walked in, poured himself coffee, and thanked me with the same gentle smile he had always worn. For a brief second, I wondered if I should hold up my phone and demand an explanation. Instead, I remembered the sentence from yesterday's English lesson, listen to understand, not to reply. I whispered it silently while flipping another pancake. The words slowed my heartbeat just enough to keep me from saying something I might regret forever. After everyone left the house, I sat alone with another slow English listening practice. The speaker repeated a simple phrase, facts first. Feelings second. Conclusions last. I paused the audio and repeated each sentence several times. The vocabulary was easy, perfect for English learners, but its message reached much deeper than grammar. I realized I had reversed the entire order. I had started with conclusions, fueled them with feelings, and completely skipped the facts. Modern psychology offers a similar explanation. Under emotional stress, the brain often relies on confirmation bias, meaning it notices only the information that supports its biggest fear while ignoring everything else. Suddenly I understood why my husband's kindness during dinner, his care for our children, and the counseling brochure had all disappeared from my thinking the moment I saw one suspicious photograph. Around noon, my phone vibrated again. It was another message from the unknown number. Today. 3 o'clock. Riverside Coffee. Come alone. There was no signature. My first instinct was to block the sender. My second was to go immediately. Instead of deciding right away, I did something completely unexpected. I called my closest friend, someone who had known both of us for years. I didn't mention the photo. I simply asked, have you noticed anything different about my husband lately? She became quiet for a moment before answering. He's looked exhausted. Honestly, I was more worried about him than your marriage. Her answer caught me completely off guard. It didn't match the story I had been building in my mind. By mid-afternoon, curiosity finally won. I drove to the cafe with shaking hands, parked across the street, and watched through the large front window. My heart pounded as I recognized the woman from the photograph. She was already sitting at a corner table, checking her watch. She looked nervous, not confident. She wasn't dressed for a secret romance. She looked like someone carrying news she wished she didn't have to deliver. I took one deep breath, remembered another simple English phrase, stay calm, and walked toward the entrance. Just before I reached the door, I saw another familiar car pull into the parking lot. My husband stepped out, looked directly at the cafe, and then looked straight at me. The expression on his face wasn't guilt. It was pure shock. A walk changed everything. What if the moment you believed your marriage was ending was actually the moment it finally began to heal? I stood outside that cafe expecting betrayal, lies, and heartbreak. Instead, I saw something I never imagined. Sometimes the biggest danger isn't what your partner is hiding. It's what pain is hiding from both of you. What happened over the next hour completely changed the meaning of the words, "I need some space." For a few long seconds, neither of us moved. My husband looked as surprised to see me as I was to see him. The woman inside the cafe noticed us through the window and slowly stood up, her expression filled with concern rather than panic. This wasn't the dramatic scene my frightened imagination had created. There was no guilty attempt to run away. No whispered excuses. Just three people frozen by a moment none of us had expected. My husband quietly walked toward me and asked, "Why are you here?" His voice was calm, but I could hear exhaustion underneath every word. I held up my phone with trembling hands and showed him the anonymous messages. I expected him to become defensive. Instead, his shoulders dropped as though he had been carrying an invisible weight for months. He closed his eyes for a brief moment before saying something I will never forget. "I was hoping you would never have to see this like this." We walked into the cafe together. The woman introduced herself as Dr. Emily Carter, a licensed family therapist my husband had been meeting for several weeks. She wasn't hiding an affair. She was helping him survive a silent emotional battle he had been too ashamed to describe. She gently explained that my husband had contacted her because he felt emotionally overwhelmed and afraid that his constant stress was slowly turning him into someone he no longer recognized. When he asked for space, he wasn't asking to leave our family. He was asking for enough room to breathe before his emotional exhaustion hurt the people he loved most. I felt relief rush through me, followed almost instantly by guilt. I had spent days preparing myself for betrayal while he had been quietly fighting himself. Dr. Carter smiled kindly and said something simple that stayed with me. People often hide pain because they believe they must protect the people they love from it. Those words reminded me of another slow English lesson I had listened to earlier that week. Strong people ask for help. I repeated the sentence softly under my breath. The vocabulary was easy, making it perfect for listening practice, but its meaning suddenly became unforgettable. Strength wasn't pretending everything was fine. Strength was admitting when life became too heavy to carry alone. Psychological studies have found that emotional burnout often causes people to withdraw, not because they love less, but because their minds become overloaded by prolonged stress. Looking back, every clue had been there. His quiet evenings, the counseling brochure, the headaches, his distant stare out the window. None of it pointed toward another relationship. It pointed toward silent suffering. After we left the cafe, we decided to walk through a nearby park instead of driving home immediately. Families were enjoying the warm afternoon, children chased bubbles across the grass, and an elderly couple laughed together while feeding ducks beside the small lake. The peaceful surroundings made our conversation feel surprisingly honest. My husband admitted that he had been terrified I would misunderstand his request for space. I confessed that I had already imagined the worst. We both laughed gently at how two intelligent adults had nearly allowed fear to become the loudest voice in our marriage. Just as we reached the parking lot, his phone rang. He glanced at the screen, and the color slowly disappeared from his face. I had never seen that expression before. He answered quietly, listened for only a few seconds, and whispered, "We'll be there immediately." Then he turned toward me with tears beginning to form in his eyes and said, "It's about our son." Our family became stronger. What would you do if one phone call erased every argument, every misunderstanding, and reminded you what truly matters? In less than 10 seconds, my fear about losing my marriage was replaced by an even deeper fear, losing the peaceful life our family had built together. Sometimes life interrupts your personal drama with a reality so powerful that it completely changes your perspective. That afternoon, my husband and I stopped fighting the wrong battle and finally stood on the same side. The drive to our son's school felt longer than any road trip I had ever taken. My husband gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Neither of us spoke much. The silence between us no longer felt cold. It felt united. We were both thinking about the same person. When we arrived, the school counselor welcomed us into her office with a gentle smile that immediately eased some of my fear. Our son was safe. He hadn't been injured. He hadn't gotten into trouble. But what she said next caught us completely by surprise. "Your son has been worried about both of you," she explained softly. "He told one of his teachers that Mom smiles less now, and Dad looks tired all the time. He asked if your family was falling apart." My heart broke into pieces. We had tried so hard to protect our children from adult stress that we never realized they had been quietly reading our emotions all along. Children often notice changes long before adults admit them. They don't always understand the reasons, but they almost always feel the atmosphere. Our son looked at us with uncertain eyes before quietly asking, "Are you two okay?" Without thinking, I wrapped my arms around him while my husband hugged both of us together. None of us cried loudly. We simply stood there, holding each other a little tighter than usual. On the drive home, nobody reached for a phone. Nobody turned on the radio. Instead, my husband looked at me and smiled for the first time in what felt like weeks. "Let's start talking again," he said. I nodded before he even finished the sentence. That evening, we decided to begin with something surprisingly simple. During dinner, everyone shared one good thing about the day and one difficult thing. Even our youngest child joined in with a tiny story about helping a classmate find a missing backpack. When it was my turn, I admitted that I had been afraid instead of honest. My husband admitted that he had confused protecting the family with hiding his struggles. Somehow those simple confessions made the room feel lighter. After dinner, I played one of my favorite slow English recordings while washing the dishes. The speaker calmly repeated, "We are a team." I smiled and repeated the sentence several times. It was short enough for any English learner to practice listening and speaking, but that evening it became much more than language practice. It became a promise. Psychological research often shows that families grow stronger not because they avoid difficult seasons, but because they face challenges together instead of carrying them alone. Looking back, I realized our marriage hadn't been damaged by one conversation. It had slowly drifted whenever we stopped sharing our hidden worries. Before going to bed, our son knocked gently on our bedroom door. "Can we have pancakes together on Saturday morning?" he asked with a hopeful grin. My husband laughed and answered before I could. "Absolutely. And I'll make the pancakes this time." Our son smiled so brightly that it felt as though sunshine had entered the room. I believed the hardest part of our story was finally behind us. I was wrong. Just before midnight, my husband opened his email to check one last work message. He stared silently at the screen, then slowly handed the laptop to me. The subject line contained only 4 words, but they were enough to make both of us stop breathing for a moment. Immediate position elimination notice. Small habits, big healing. Could one email destroy a family, or secretly save it? When my husband showed me the words immediate position elimination notice, I expected panic to take over our home. Instead, something completely unexpected happened. Looking back, losing what felt like our biggest source of security became the moment we discovered what had been quietly keeping us alive all along. Sometimes the strongest marriages aren't built during easy seasons, they're rebuilt one ordinary day at a time. I read the email twice before I finally believed it. My husband's position had been eliminated as part of a company restructuring. There was no warning, no dramatic meeting, no long goodbye. Just a polite corporate message thanking him for his years of dedication. A week earlier, I would have assumed this news meant disaster. I probably would have connected it to every fear already living inside my mind. But something had changed between us. Instead of looking away, my husband looked directly into my eyes and quietly said, "I'm scared." Those 3 words meant more to me than any promise could have. For the first time in weeks, neither of us was pretending to be stronger than we actually felt. I reached for his hand and answered with complete honesty. "Me too." The room stayed silent for a few seconds, but this silence felt completely different from the one that had almost separated us. It wasn't filled with distance. It was filled with understanding. The following morning, our routine continued almost as usual. The kids still needed breakfast. Lunchboxes still had to be packed. The dog still wanted his morning walk around our peaceful neighborhood. Life didn't pause simply because our plans had changed. Oddly enough, that normal routine became comforting. It reminded us that stability isn't created by a job title. It's created by the people sitting around your kitchen table. During breakfast, my husband surprised everyone by making pancakes exactly as he had promised our son. They weren't perfect. One was almost burned, another looked more like the shape of Texas than a circle. And the children laughed so hard that syrup nearly spilled across the table. That laughter healed something inside our house that money never could. Later that afternoon, while organizing the living room, I played another slow English listening lesson. The speaker repeated a sentence that felt almost written for us. Small steps every day create big changes. I repeated it several times, carefully matching the pronunciation. The sentence was short and easy for English learners, but its meaning stayed with me long after the recording ended. Instead of worrying about the next 6 months, we focused on the next 6 hours. My husband updated his resume. I reviewed our monthly budget. We took a family walk after dinner without checking our phones every few minutes. Behavioral psychologists often explain that creating small daily routines during stressful periods gives the brain a greater sense of control, reducing anxiety and helping families remain emotionally connected. We unknowingly began doing exactly that. Every evening we shared one gratitude before bed. Every morning we drank coffee together, even if only for 10 quiet minutes. Every afternoon we reminded each other that difficult seasons eventually pass. Days slowly became lighter. Then something unexpected happened. My husband received a phone call from an old colleague inviting him to interview for a new opportunity. It wasn't guaranteed. It wasn't even the same career path. But for the first time since losing his job, I saw genuine hope return to his face. We celebrated with homemade pizza and a movie night, telling ourselves that whatever happened, we would face it together. Just before going to sleep, I checked my email one last time. Among the ordinary advertisements and newsletters was a message with no sender name and no subject line. My heart immediately recognized the feeling before my mind did. I clicked it open. Inside was only one sentence. You still don't know who sent the first messages, and there's one truth your husband hasn't discovered yet. Understanding American love. Have you ever wondered whether the biggest secret in your life was never hidden from you, but hidden for you? I thought our family had finally survived the hardest chapter. My husband was smiling again. Our children were laughing again. Hope had quietly returned to our home. Then one anonymous email reminded me that unfinished stories have a strange way of finding you just when you think life is becoming normal. This time, I promised myself I would choose truth over fear. I stared at the message for several minutes before closing my laptop. Unlike the first anonymous texts, this one didn't immediately fill me with panic. It filled me with curiosity. A few weeks earlier, I would have secretly investigated every possibility by myself. Now I walked into the living room where my husband was helping our daughter build a small science project for school. He looked up and smiled, and I realized something important. We had rebuilt something much more valuable than certainty. We had rebuilt honesty. After the kids went to bed, I showed him the email without saying a word. He read it carefully, looked back at me, and quietly asked, "Do you believe it?" I thought for a moment before answering. I don't know. But I don't want fear making decisions for us anymore. He reached across the table and gently squeezed my hand. Then let's find the truth together. That simple sentence reminded me why our marriage felt different now. In many American families, I had noticed that healthy relationships were less about pretending everything was perfect and more about creating space where difficult conversations could happen without shame. I used to think space meant emotional distance. Now I understood that healthy space could also mean giving someone room to breathe while still standing beside them. The next afternoon, we returned to the counseling center together. Dr. Emily smiled warmly as we explained the mysterious messages. She listened without interrupting before saying something that stayed with both of us. When people experience betrayal, or even the fear of betrayal, the brain searches for certainty. Unfortunately, certainty is exactly what anonymous messages pretend to offer. Psychological research supports this idea. Under stress, our minds naturally give more attention to threatening information than reassuring evidence, a pattern called negativity bias. Simply knowing that helped us slow down before believing every frightening possibility. After our appointment, my husband suggested we walk through a nearby community park. Families were enjoying a local weekend festival with food trucks, live music, and children chasing colorful balloons across the grass. Watching so many ordinary families laughing together reminded me that every marriage carries private struggles invisible to everyone else. No relationship is as perfect as social media suggests, and almost none are as hopeless as fear whispers during lonely nights. While we walked, I listened to another slow English lesson through one earbud. The speaker repeated, "Trust grows through actions." I smiled and repeated the sentence aloud several times. It was clear, slow, and easy to understand, making it perfect listening practice, but it also described exactly what had been happening between us. We weren't rebuilding our marriage with dramatic speeches. We were rebuilding it through ordinary actions. Honest conversations. Shared meals. Morning coffee. Evening walks. Small promises kept every single day. Just before sunset, my husband's phone rang. It was the company where he had interviewed earlier that week. They offered him a new position with flexible hours and a healthier work-life balance than his previous job. We hugged each other right there in the middle of the park while our children cheered loud enough to make nearby strangers smile. It felt like the beginning of a beautiful new chapter. But as we drove home, my phone vibrated once again. Another anonymous message had arrived. This time it included only one photograph. It was an old family picture taken years ago. One face had been circled in red. Beneath it were 7 chilling words: "This person started everything, not your husband." The conversation we needed. What if the person you blamed never betrayed you at all? And what if the real turning point wasn't discovering who sent the anonymous messages, but discovering why they had the power to hurt you in the first place? I thought I was chasing a hidden enemy. Instead, I was about to face a truth that every marriage eventually meets. The greatest battles are rarely between two people. They happen inside two hearts that have quietly stopped speaking with complete honesty. I couldn't take my eyes off the old family photograph. One familiar face had been circled in red, but there was no explanation, no name, and no evidence to support the accusation. Weeks earlier, I would have spent hours trying to solve the mystery alone. This time, I did something completely different. I handed my phone directly to my husband. He studied the picture carefully before letting out a slow breath. "I'm done letting anonymous messages control our lives," he said quietly. His words didn't sound angry. They sounded free. We agreed that if someone truly wanted to help us, they wouldn't continue hiding behind anonymous emails designed to create fear. That realization felt strangely empowering. Instead of chasing another clue, we decided to chase something much more valuable: a real conversation. That evening, after the children were asleep, we sat together on our back porch beneath a clear American summer sky. The neighborhood was peaceful. Porch lights glowed softly across the street, and somewhere in the distance someone was playing quiet music. For the first time in many months, there were no phones between us, no television in the background, and no excuses to avoid difficult questions. I looked at my husband and simply asked, "When you said you needed space, what did you hope I would hear?" He thought for a long moment before answering. "I hoped you would hear that I was exhausted, not that I wanted to leave." His voice cracked slightly, and I realized how lonely he must have felt carrying that misunderstanding alone. Then he asked me the same question. "When I said those words, what did you actually hear?" I smiled sadly before answering. "I heard goodbye." We both laughed softly, not because the moment was funny, but because the difference between those two meanings suddenly seemed enormous. One simple English word had nearly rewritten our entire story. That night reminded me why context matters so much, not only when learning English, but also when learning the language of the people we love. Earlier that day, I had practiced another slow English sentence: "Can you help me understand?" I repeated it several times because it was easy to pronounce and useful in everyday conversation. Sitting beside my husband, I realized it might be one of the most powerful sentences anyone could ever learn. Relationship experts often explain that emotionally healthy couples replace assumptions with curiosity. Instead of asking, "Why are you doing this to me?" they ask, "Help me understand what you're feeling." That small shift lowers defensiveness and creates emotional safety, allowing honest conversations to replace fearful imagination. Looking back, I understood that our marriage had not been saved by one dramatic moment. It had been saved by dozens of small choices to stay curious, stay patient, and keep talking even when the conversation felt uncomfortable. Before we went inside, my husband reached into his pocket and handed me a folded piece of paper. It wasn't another counseling brochure or a work document. It was a handwritten note he had started writing weeks earlier but never found the courage to give me. Across the top, in careful handwriting, were the words, "Thank you for staying." Tears filled my eyes before I finished reading. Just then, my phone buzzed one final time. The anonymous account that had haunted us for weeks had sent its last message. There were only 6 words on the screen. "You finally learned the real lesson." Then the account disappeared forever. Love after the distance. What if the happiest ending doesn't begin with perfect love, but with one imperfect conversation? And what if the sentence that almost ended my marriage became the sentence that saved it forever? If you've stayed with me until this moment, you've probably realized this story was never only about marriage. It was about fear, trust, simple English, and the quiet courage to ask one more question before walking away. The final chapter surprised me more than any twist before it. A few months have passed since the last anonymous message disappeared. And sometimes I still think about how close I came to believing a story that was never true. Life in our home here in the United States feels different now, not because every problem magically vanished, but because we finally stopped pretending that strong families never struggle. My husband accepted the new job, and although the salary was slightly lower than before, something much more valuable returned to our lives. He came home smiling again. We ate dinner together without checking emails every few minutes. Saturday pancakes became a real family tradition instead of a promise delayed by work. Even our children noticed the difference. One evening our son looked around the dinner table, grinned, and said, "It feels louder in here." We laughed because he was right. The house wasn't louder because of noise. It was louder because joy had quietly returned. Looking back, I finally understood what my husband meant when he asked for space. He wasn't asking for distance from me. He was asking for room to breathe without feeling guilty for being tired. And I wasn't wrong for feeling afraid. I was simply listening through the filter of fear instead of the filter of trust. That single misunderstanding almost changed the direction of our entire future. Since then, I've continued practicing slow English every morning while drinking coffee by the kitchen window. One sentence has become my favorite: "Let's talk before we assume." It's short, natural, and easy to repeat, making it perfect for English listening, reading, and speaking practice. But every time I say those words, I remember that language isn't only about vocabulary. It's about connection. Scientists who study long-term relationships often find that couples who stay emotionally curious during stressful seasons tend to build stronger resilience over time. Curiosity lowers defensiveness, encourages empathy, and creates healthier communication. We didn't save our marriage because we were extraordinary people. We saved it because we slowly replaced fear with honest questions, one conversation at a time. Sometimes viewers ask whether this story is completely true. My answer is simple. The emotions are absolutely real. The misunderstandings are real. The lessons are real. Whether your own story looks exactly like mine doesn't matter. What matters is that somewhere, someone listening today may also be replaying one painful sentence in their mind, wondering if hope has already disappeared. If that's you, I hope you'll pause before believing your darkest assumption. Ask one more question. Listen one more time. Stay one more conversation. You may discover that the person standing beside you has been fighting a battle you never knew existed. As the sun sets outside my window tonight, I feel grateful for ordinary moments that once seemed invisible. A shared cup of coffee. Children laughing upstairs. A husband smiling from the living room while asking, "Are you ready for our evening walk?" Those ordinary moments are no longer ordinary to me. They are reminders that love is rarely built through grand romantic gestures. It grows quietly through patience, forgiveness, honesty, and the willingness to keep showing up for each other. And if this story helped you practice English while reminding you not to give up on the people you love, then perhaps every difficult chapter was worth telling after all. Because sometimes the sentence that scares us the most becomes the beginning of the life we were always meant to live. That is all for today. I'll create many more stories like this in the future. Please subscribe so you don't miss the next one.